What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming. The year was 1913, when the air in small-town Connecticut carried the sweet, restless scent of wood smoke and freshly oiled sewing machines. The world was changing, factories rising, horses replaced by the rattle of engines, but in the quiet homes tucked behind maple trees and steepled churches, women still sewed dolls by hand, weaving love into every stitch. Among them was Margaret Bellamy, a seamstress with gentle eyes and the habit of humming hymns that never reached their final note. She lived in a narrow house beside a weeping willow, her workshop filled with fabric scraps, candlelight, and the faint echo of her late daughter's laughter. The neighbors spoke kindly of her, though they whispered too about the way she still set a place for her child at dinner. Years after the fever took her, Margaret's hands were thin, delicate, trembling with purpose. She had not made a doll in years, not since the night her daughter, Anna, died with a rag doll clutched in her fever-slick palms. That doll had burned with the rest of the child's things when grief became unbearable. Yet something lingered, a whisper that came from the silence of the house. Make another. At first she ignored it, but grief has a rhythm, and sometimes it speaks in the language of creation. One autumn evening, as the wind brushed through the willow and the lanterns dimmed, Margaret began to sew again. She did not plan it. Her hands simply moved. She cut the cloth, soft as breath, dyed the yarn in blood-red hues, and stitched the eyes from 2 old buttons she found in her late husband's coat. With every loop and pull of the thread, she felt the room grow heavier, the air thick with the scent of iron and something older, almost like rain over graves. She whispered as she worked, the way she used to when making toys for her daughter. "You'll be my little Annie," she murmured. The whisper that answered her wasn't her own. "Yes, Mama." She froze. The needle pricked her finger, and a drop of blood slid down, soaking into the fabric. The thread trembled, as if pulling itself. The air shifted just slightly, but enough that the flame of her candle flared blue. Margaret shook her head. The mind, she told herself, was fragile in sorrow. And yet, as the hours passed, she felt less alone. By dawn, the doll sat finished in her lap, red yarn hair, blue dress, and that wide painted smile. But behind that smile was something unsettling, an almost knowing tilt to the head, a suggestion that it was aware of being seen. Margaret named her Annabelle, after her lost child, a name that tasted like hope and mourning all at once. That morning, when the first light touched the willow outside, Margaret thought she saw the branches sway, though no wind stirred. From somewhere deep in the house, a soft creak echoed the sound of a small footstep. She turned to the doll. The smile seemed wider to first night. The dreams began. Margaret dreamed of Anna standing in the doorway, her hair tangled, her voice soft as candle smoke. "Mama," she said, "you made me new." In the dream, Margaret reached for her daughter, but when her hand touched her cheek, she felt not skin, but fabric. The child's eyes were buttons. She woke with a cry, the sound swallowed by the shadows. The doll sat beside her on the bed, one arm raised as if in greeting. The days passed, and life seemed to hum again. Margaret spoke to the doll as she would to her daughter, setting it near the window, brushing its hair. But the boundaries between comfort and obsession began to blur. The doll was never quite where she left it. Sometimes, its head turned toward the door, as if listening. Sometimes, the curtains stirred though the windows were closed. When visitors came, they left quickly, unsettled by something they couldn't name. One neighbor swore she heard a child's giggle from the sewing room late at night. Another said she saw 2 shadows in the window, though Margaret lived alone. Winter came early that year, harsh and bitter. The willow outside turned skeletal, its branches like bony fingers clawing at the house. Inside, the air was thick with murmurs. Margaret had stopped going to church. She said she no longer needed to, that her little girl was home again. She spoke often now, her voice calm but distant. "Anna doesn't like strangers," she told the mailman one morning. "She says they smell of the grave." The man laughed nervously and left, without waiting for her signature. By then, the doll sat in a chair by the fireplace, facing the door. Its eyes, once painted bright, seemed darker in the flicker of flame, almost reflective. Margaret had taken to leaving milk by its feet, as if feeding something that wasn't made of cloth. One stormy night, When thunder rolled through the valley and the air smelled of ozone, something inside the house changed. The fire guttered, the wind screamed through the chimney, and the lights dimmed. Margaret, sewing by lamplight, looked up to see the doll had fallen from its chair. She went to pick it up, but when her fingers brushed its hand, the fabric pulsed faintly. She froze. The air behind her shifted. From the doorway came a voice, small, trembling, familiar. "Mama." She turned. The doll was still in her hand, but in the shadows by the wall stood a child, pale, hollow-eyed, and swaying gently, as if balancing between worlds. The candlelight flickered. The child smiled, and the smile mirrored the doll's. That night, the neighbors heard screaming, a sound that started as grief and ended as something else, something raw and ancient. When they broke down the door, they found the house in disarray. The sewing machine lay overturned, the curtains torn, the walls scrawled with thread dot. Margaret was gone. Only the doll remained, sitting upright in the rocking chair. Its dress smeared with ash dot. In its lap lay a single lock of grey hair, tied with red thread. The house stood empty for months, then years. Dust gathered, the willow outside died and withered into a hollow shell. But sometimes, travelers passing by claimed to see a faint light in the window, like a candle burning long after it should have gone out. When the estate was finally sold, the new owners found the doll in the attic, sitting among the cobwebs, untouched by time. One of them, a woman named Clara, took it home for her daughter, and the cycle began again. In the nights that followed, the little girl whispered to her mother about her new friend Annabelle. "She talks to me," the girl said, "when you're asleep." Clara smiled, thinking it was imagination. But as weeks passed, she began to notice small things. The doll never stayed in one place. Sometimes it sat by the door, sometimes on the stairs. Once, she found it at the foot of her bed, head tilted, watching. The house grew cold. Shadows lingered longer than light, and at times, Clara could swear she heard sewing, faint, rhythmic, coming from the walls. When she followed the sound one night, she found a single thread stretched across the hallway, crimson as blood dot. At the end of it sat the doll, dot waiting. The whispers grew bolder, clearer. "She's lonely," her daughter said one morning. "She wants a new family." And so, it continued from house to house, from hand to hand, always bringing comfort first, then ruin. Each owner believed they were special, that the doll's presence was harmless until the dreams began. Dreams of sewing machines, of hands that bled without pain, of laughter that echoed from inside the walls. Some woke to find their names stitched into the doll's dress. Others didn't wake at all. By the 1930s, the doll had already changed form. The colors dulled, the smile cracked, and beneath the layers of age, it seemed to evolve no longer the innocent toy of a mother's love, but a vessel refined by grief. What began as sorrow had become hunger, and as the decades passed, so did the stories, each whisper feeding the ghost that lived inside. The remnant of Margaret's loss now twisted into something else, something aware. They called her many names, but in the shadows of every retelling, she called herself one, Annabelle. The year was 1918. The air still tasted of war, smoke, and forgotten prayers. Factories trembled with the sounds of restless machines, and America was recovering from the Great War and the flu that had stolen so many. Somewhere deep in the Connecticut countryside, where fog coiled through apple orchards and the world smelled faintly of wood smoke and sorrow, there stood a small cottage with peeling white paint, a house belonging to a seamstress named Margaret Withers. She was not remarkable to anyone who passed her on the road. Her hair was always tied back with a ribbon, her fingers rough from thread and needle, and her eyes carried a softness that had long turned to melancholy. Margaret's husband had gone to France to fight and never returned. Letters stopped coming. Hope became a ghost she spoke to at night, dot in her silence. She began to sew. She made dolls, little rag dolls for the neighborhood children. Cotton, buttons, red yarn hair. Her hands moved mechanically at first, out of habit, but one evening, beneath the dim orange glow of her kerosene lamp, her grief shifted into something else, something darker. That night, she whispered his name, her husband's name, while stitching the face of a new doll. "Thomas, come back to me." The storm outside roared like an angry spirit. Lightning ripped across the sky, and when she drove the final needle through the doll's heart, thunder answered as though the heavens themselves had taken notice. The doll's eyes, mismatched black buttons, seemed to glisten. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her chair, the doll in her lap, humming the tune Thomas used to hum when fixing the fence in summer. It was a lullaby, now trembling, fragile, desperate, and that was when the sound came. A soft shuffle, a whisper, a knock, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. Margaret's candle flickered, her breath caught when she opened the door. No one was there, only the wind, and something that smelled faintly of iron and old earth. She turned back toward her sewing table and froze. The doll was gone. In its place was a smear of mud, shaped like the outline of a hand. That was the beginning. Over the following days, the doll would appear in strange places: on her bed, on the rocking chair, at the window staring out into the orchard. Once, Margaret found it lying face down in the dirt outside, soaked in dew, its yarn hair tangled with leaves. And then came the voice. At first, a faint whisper in her dreams, then clearer, stronger. Margaret, why did you leave me? Why didn't you call me home? She began to believe in her fevered grief that somehow Thomas's soul had returned, that he lived inside the doll. So she kept it close, fed it her loneliness, sang to it each night. But the thing inside the doll was not her husband. It knew her memories. It mimicked his voice perfectly, but its laughter came at the wrong times. Its words twisted with strange hunger. And as weeks turned into months, Margaret began to fade. Her cheeks hollowed, her eyes dulled, her hands trembled. Neighbors said she was sick, that her sorrow had eaten her alive. But one morning, when the mailman came by, he found the cottage door open, swinging in the wind. But Margaret was gone. Only the doll remained, sitting in her chair by the sewing table, its button eyes fixed on the door. Its small cloth hand was smeared with something dark. Blood, ink, no one could tell. The authorities never found her. They searched the orchards, the creek, even the old wells. The only trace was a piece of thread, crimson red, tangled in a thorn bush, fluttering in the wind like a pulse. The doll was taken by a local family, the Danvers, who thought it a lovely relic of the old woman's craft. They placed it on the mantel in their daughter's room, a girl named Clara, 6 years old. For a while, the house was peaceful again, but then Clara began to talk to the doll at night. Her parents would hear her whispering, sometimes giggling, sometimes crying, and when they asked her who she was speaking to, she would answer, "The lady who cries by the window." One night, the mother entered Clara's room and saw something she would never forget. The doll was sitting upright on the floor, facing the mirror. Clara sat behind it, combing its yarn hair with her little brush. The reflection in the mirror, however, showed 2 faces staring back, Clara's and a woman's, pale, hollow-eyed, weeping. The mirror cracked from corner to corner. Clara screamed, the doll fell, and when the father rushed in, every candle in the house extinguished at once. From that day forward, the Danvers family was never the same. Clara fell ill, fever, nightmares, voices calling her name. She spoke in a language no one understood. Sometimes she would wake up with tiny thread marks on her skin, like something had stitched her in her sleep. A priest was called, a local exorcist. They prayed, sprinkled holy water, burned sage. The doll was sealed in a chest, then buried beneath the old oak outside. But the next morning, it was back, sitting on the porch, mud-caked but smiling. The priest left that day and never returned. Time moved on. The house was eventually abandoned. The orchard withered. Only the doll endured, passed from one hand to another, appearing in thrift stores, children's nurseries, even traveling fairs. Each time, it brought with it a whisper of tragedy, fires, disappearances, sudden deaths. It had become more than a toy. It was a vessel, a memory that refused to die. And as decades passed, as fashions changed and the world became louder, colder, more electric, the doll adapted. It found new hands, new homes. It fed on attention, on fascination, on fear, until one day, in the early 1970s, it came into the possession of 2 young nurses in Hartford, Connecticut, Donna and Angie. They thought it was sweet, a vintage Raggedy Ann doll, gifted by a mother who found it at an antique shop. They placed it on a sofa. It smelled faintly of lavender and dust. For a time, it was nothing more than decoration, until the scratching began. At night, behind the walls, inside the closet. Then, notes appeared on parchment paper that neither of them owned, written in a childlike scrawl, "Help me, help us, help Annabelle." They thought it was a prank, until they found the doll in another room, standing upright, its hands outstretched, its yarn hair clumped as if wet. The final night before they called the Warrens, Donna awoke to a cold pressure on her chest. She couldn't breathe. She opened her eyes and saw the doll sitting on her. its button eyes black as oil. Staring deep into her, she screamed, and the lights shattered. When the Warrens arrived, they knew at once what it was. Not a spirit of a child, not a ghost asking for help, but a demonic entity mimicking innocence to gain permission. They took the doll, contained it, locked it within a glass case in their occult museum with the warning, positively, do not open. But even sealed, the doll breathes. The glass fogs at night. Visitors claim to hear whispers. Once, a man mocked the story, banged on the glass, and hours later, he died in a motorcycle crash. The curse was not broken. It merely slept, and beneath that glass, the spirit of Margaret Withers, or whatever wore her memory like a mask, still waits, whispering, sowing, remembering, for evil, once created through grief and longing, does not vanish. It only changes form. And Raggedy Ann, the smiling doll of childhood innocence, had become something else entirely. It had become Annabelle. The rain had begun before twilight, tapping the roof of the Warren residence like a warning. Inside their occult museum, shadows crawled along the glass cases, brushing over crucifixes, relics, and haunted trinkets that pulsed with invisible life. But only one case tucked away in the farthest corner seemed to breathe. That was where she was kept. Annabelle, her red yarn hair had dulled to rust. Her cloth skin had darkened with age, and her eyes, those black button eyes, had begun to cloud like storm glass. Yet, beneath that stitched smile, there was something alive, something patient, something ancient. Ed Warren had long since felt it. Every night, after locking the museum doors, he would glance toward the doll and sense her watching. Lorraine warned him never to look too long, never to meet her stare. But that night, as the rain turned to thunder and the wind howled through the maples outside, Ed caught sight of her face, and the world seemed to tilt. The doll was no longer where she should be. The case was fogged, fingerprints pressed from the inside. Lorraine entered the room, her crucifix trembling in her hand. "She's awake again," she whispered. Ed nodded. Someone must have stirred her. Earlier that week, a college group had visited. One boy, a skeptic, had taunted the doll, tapping the glass, calling her just a rag stuffed with legend. Lorraine had felt the ripple in the air, like a scream no one could hear. The boy had laughed it off. 2 days later, he was dead on the highway. Ed and Lorraine had seen many. They had faced shadows that spoke, mirrors that bled, rooms that remembered their victims. But Annabelle was different. She wasn't haunted, she was the haunting itself. The storm outside deepened, the lights flickering as though the house breathed with the doll. Lorraine felt it first, a tightening in her chest, the cold breath of something moving through the walls. She closed her eyes, and instantly, visions poured in Margaret Withers's cottage. The old sewing table, blood on thread, a storm like this one over 100 years ago. She gasped. It's her, the woman who made the doll. She's still bound to it. The candles around them sputtered and went out. From somewhere near the floor came the faint sound of a lullaby. "Thomas, come back to me." Lorraine's voice trembled. She's singing through the doll. The case began to rattle. The glass bulged as if something inside pressed outward. Then, with a sound like cracking bone, the glass shattered. Annabelle fell forward. She landed softly on the floor, face first, her arms limp. The room filled with the smell of iron and lavender. Ed lifted the crucifix, his voice steady but low. "In the name of the Father, the Son." The words never finished. The lights exploded in a burst of white. Lorraine was thrown backward, striking the wall. Ed stumbled toward her, but the air thickened, every breath like inhaling smoke. On the floor, the doll began to move. Her head turned, slowly, painfully. The button eyes glistened with wetness like real eyes, and from her mouth came a voice not of cloth, but of something beneath. "You took me from her. You sealed me away, but she still calls to me." Lorraine's cross glowed faintly. "Who are you?" A whisper, a hiss, 1,000 layered voices. "We are what grief made, we are what love destroyed." And then, like a wind bursting through every corner of the room, the memories came, alive around them. They stood not in their museum, but in Margaret's cottage, transported through the echo of the curse. The storm was the same. The air smelled of wet wood and tears. Margaret sat at her sewing table, her hands moving endlessly, her eyes hollow. Lorraine could see it, how the entity first entered, a shape, smoky and formless, drawn by Margaret's despair, a demonic parasite, feeding on her sorrow, whispering promises of reunion. When she sewed the doll, she unknowingly gave it a body. Ed whispered, "She bound it through love. That's why it cannot be destroyed." The room trembled. The ghost of Margaret looked up, her lips pale. "He came back to me," she murmured, "but he wasn't my Thomas." Behind her, the doll's shadow grew taller, its smile stretching like torn fabric. The demon's voice filled the air, echoing through every wall. "She made me, and through her, I learned how to hide. In innocence, in pity, in love." The illusion shattered. Ed and Lorraine were back in the museum. Annabelle stood upright now, surrounded by a flickering halo of dark energy. Objects around her lifted into the air, the crucifixes twisted. The walls groaned, the air vibrated like a scream. Lorraine fell to her knees, clutching her rosary. "You're bound by faith," she whispered. "You can't leave your vessel." The doll tilted its head. "Faith is only strong when it is pure, and yours is trembling." The rosary snapped. Lorraine gasped as invisible hands seized her throat. Ed rushed forward, forcing the doll back into its case, shouting prayers through the chaos. Each word felt heavier, burning through the darkness. The demon shrieked, not a sound of pain, but of fury, like a mother robbed of her child. And then, silence. The air stilled. The case sealed itself again, as if the glass melted back into form. Ed fell beside Lorraine, his hands shaking. "It's done," he said, but his voice was hollow. Lorraine looked up at the case. Annabelle's head had turned toward them, her smile even wider than before. "She's never done," Lorraine whispered. That night, Lorraine dreamed of Margaret again. She saw her walking through the orchard, the same red ribbon in her hair, the same haunted eyes. She carried the doll in her arms, humming softly, her voice echoing through time. "Every stitch," she said, "was a promise. Every tear, a door." Lorraine awoke in cold sweat. The glass of Annabelle's case was fogged again, as though something had breathed against it. And there, scrawled from the inside, faint but visible, was a single word: "Remember." Days turned to weeks. Ed and Lorraine continued their work, but the energy in the museum changed. Sometimes, late at night, Lorraine would hear the faint sound of sewing needle through cloth echoing from the corner. Once, she found a single red thread lying across the floor, leading from the case to the door of their bedroom. She followed it until it vanished beneath her feet. The next morning, she told Ed they needed to reinforce the case with additional blessings. But when they returned to the museum, they found Father Corrigan, the priest, who blessed their relics, waiting by the door, pale and trembling. "I dreamed of her," he said. "The doll. She said she's waiting for someone new." Lorraine asked. He looked at her, eyes hollow. "The one who made her." For a moment, the air went cold. Outside, thunder rolled. Lorraine's hand trembled as she turned toward the case. The doll was there, unmoved, but a faint red thread now wound around its neck tight, like a noose, and behind it, reflected in the glass, was the faint outline of a woman's face. Margaret's weeping, smiling. Both. Ed whispered a prayer, but his words faltered. Lorraine felt something deeper, an understanding that chilled her more than fear. The curse had never been about the demon alone. It had been about longing, the most human of all emotions. A longing so deep it had opened a door between worlds, and that door had never truly closed. When they sealed the museum for the night, Lorraine looked back one last time. The lights dimmed, the room thick with silence. Then, faintly, through the static hum of the storm outside, she heard it like a whisper through fabric. "Thomas, come back to me." The sound grew fainter as she walked away, but she knew what it meant. Somewhere, through the veil, through the ages, Margaret Withers still searching for her lost love, still binding pieces of her grief into something that could not die. And Annabelle, the cursed doll born from her sorrow, waited patiently in her glass coffin for the next soul who would listen, for the next heart broken enough to let her in. Because evil does not always begin with malice. Sometimes, it begins with love that refuses to let go. And the demon that hides inside the smile of Raggedy Ann, Annabelle's true form, was not just a ghost. It was the echo of human pain turned eternal.
The morning after the storm, sunlight crept over Monroe, Connecticut, like a hesitant blessing. The Warren home looked ordinary again, quiet, small, unassuming. But inside, something had shifted. Lorraine felt it the moment she awoke. The air carried a weight, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She went to the window, gazing at the soaked garden, the dew glimmering like tears. The world had returned to peace, but peace, she knew, was only the pause between hauntings downstairs. Ed sat by the breakfast table, his Bible open, untouched coffee cooling beside him. He didn't look up when she entered. She spoke again last night, he said softly. Lorraine froze. The doll. Ed nodded. A woman's voice, not the demon. Softer this time, sadder. She said my name. He looked up, and there was fear in his eyes, not of the supernatural, but of something more human. Compassion. Pity. Maybe she isn't gone, Lorraine, he said. Maybe she's trapped, still sewing, still calling. Lorraine placed her hand on his. That's how she keeps you. That's how she kept Margaret. Don't let her in. But her own voice trembled. For deep down she understood. The true horror of Annabelle wasn't the demon that possessed her. It was the story itself. The endless loop of grief and longing that never found rest. Every person who touched the doll carried a piece of Margaret's sorrow, as though each life became a new stitch in the same tapestry of despair. Lorraine turned toward the museum door. We should pray again. Reinforce the seal. They entered the room together. Sunlight fell through the stained glass window, scattering colors across the floor. Dust motes drifted through the beam, glowing like tiny spirits. Every object in the room felt still, subdued. Every cursed mirror, every relic, every idol quiet in reverence or fear, except her, Annabelle. She sat perfectly still in her glass case, her button eyes catching the light. But there was something wrong. Her head was tilted differently now, her smile slightly wider. Lorraine's breath caught. Ed, she whispered, did you move her? He shook his head. Then came the sound, faint at first, almost too soft to hear. Stitch, stitch, stitch. Lorraine turned. The sewing sound came from everywhere and nowhere. The air itself seemed to hum with it. She felt a sudden ache in her chest, a pull, as though her heart were being threaded through an invisible needle. Do you hear that? She asked. Ed's face had gone pale. She's trying to make something new. Before either could move, the temperature dropped. Frost crept along the edges of the glass case. The light dimmed, replaced by a slow, pulsing red glow that came not from any lamp, but from the doll. And then, the whisper, not from Annabelle this time, from behind them. Thomas. Lorraine spun. The air wavered like a veil being drawn aside. And there she was. Margaret Withers. Her form was translucent, her eyes empty wells of longing. Her hands, forever sewing, pulled an invisible thread through the air. Please, she whispered. I only wanted him back. Ed stepped forward, the crucifix trembling in his hand. Margaret, you opened a door. You let something through. Her lips quivered. I know, but it was all I had left. Lorraine could see it, the pain that had outlived death. This was not the rage of a demon, but the sorrow of a soul who had given love shape, and in doing so, had made love monstrous. The room darkened. The faint sewing sound turned frantic. The doll's eyes glowed red. She's feeding on her, Lorraine said. The demon's still here. The crucifix flared with light. Ed began to pray, his voice echoing through the room like thunder in a chapel. The doll convulsed within the glass case, pressing against the barrier. Cracks spidered outward. Shadows flooded the walls, taking the shapes of faces, hundreds of them. Men, women, children, all whispering, all weeping. They were the doll's history, every soul that had touched it, every spirit that had answered its call. The air pulsed. Lorraine dropped to her knees, clutching her chest. She was no longer in the museum. She stood in a vast, endless room made of red thread, an ocean of fabric stretching to the horizon, stitched together from grief. Each thread pulsed with a heartbeat. And there, in the center, sat Margaret, sewing endlessly. Lorraine approached. You have to stop, she said. You're keeping them all here. Margaret didn't look up. If I stop, they'll fade. I can't lose them again. Lorraine knelt beside her. You're not keeping them alive. You're keeping them trapped. Even love can become a prison. The woman's hands slowed. The needle hovered in midair. Then, the demon's voice filled the void. Deeper, darker, shaking the fabric of that unreal space. She cannot stop. She made us. She is us. The threads began to tighten, wrapping round Lorraine's wrists, pulling her toward the center. She gasped, struggling as the fabric climbed her arms like living veins. From within the crimson sea, the doll emerged, Annabelle's true form, enormous, terrifying. Her smile was no longer stitched, it was carved, torn wide by unseen hands. The red yarn of her hair bled into the floor. Lorraine screamed a prayer, her voice breaking. In the name of the one who made light, let this creation unmake itself. The red threads ignited, burning like 1,000 candles in the dark. Margaret looked up at last, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Thomas, I'm sorry." And with that, she dropped the needle. The entire world of fabric unraveled, threads snapping, screams echoing as every bound soul was released. Then, silence. Lorraine awoke on the museum floor, gasping for air. Ed knelt beside her, clutching her hand. The case was whole again. The doll sat motionless. "Is it over?" he asked. Lorraine stared at the doll. The smile was smaller now, almost serene. "Maybe," she said. "For now." Days turned to weeks. The museum reopened. Visitors came, whispered, stared, and left, each leaving behind a bit of fascination, a trace of fear. And sometimes, at night, when the air was still and moonlight poured through the window, Lorraine would hear it again. Stitch, stitch, stitch. One evening, she found a single red thread lying on the hallway floor. It led toward her study, where a small Raggedy Ann replica she'd bought years ago sat on her desk. She hadn't thought about it in years. The thread ended there. The doll smiled. Lorraine didn't touch it. She simply turned off the light and walked away, whispering to herself the words that had haunted her ever since that night. "Love that refuses to die never dies alone." Years passed. Ed and Lorraine grew older. The museum became a place of legend, a sanctuary for believers, a curiosity for skeptics. But Annabelle remained the same. Her smile never faded. Her eyes never closed. And sometimes when storms gathered over Monroe, when lightning flashed against the glass, her reflection would change. Not into the demon, not into Margaret, but into whoever dared to look too long. She mirrored them, their pain, their fear, their longing, because Annabelle's curse was never about possession. It was about reflection. She showed people the darkness of what they desired most, the thing they could not release. A child lost, a lover gone, a wish unanswered. The doll didn't create evil. She reminded you of it, and so the world moved on. But the whisper remained through stories, through films, through fear itself. The face of Raggedy Ann became the face of Annabelle, and the real doll, the original, smiling, unassuming Raggedy Ann, locked behind glass, watched as humanity turned her legend into entertainment. Each retelling, each reenactment, each terrified gaze fed her, strengthened her. She became the embodiment of belief, and belief, even in darkness, is a kind of prayer. And somewhere, beyond the thin veil of night, Margaret still sewed. Her ghostly fingers still moved, stitching together every retelling, every whisper, every fear, until the story itself became immortal, until the horror was no longer about the doll, but about us. Because what is a haunting if not memory refusing to rest, and what is a ghost if not the echo of love that has nowhere else to go? So if you ever find yourself alone in a quiet room, and you hear the faint rhythm of a needle-piercing cloth, stitch, 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 don't look around. Don't follow the sound, because she's still out there, in the glass, in the thread, in the story itself, waiting for someone who believes enough to set her free again. And when you finally see her smile, when her button eyes meet yours, you'll understand the final terrible truth. Annabelle was never trapped in that doll. She's been inside us all along.